Welcome everybody, to everybody who's watching back home. This is an installment for the Elemental Talks. My name is Paddy James. I'll be hosting this discussion today. I'm delighted to say that we've got a sponsor for today's video, which is the Energy Systems Catapult. So before we go into introducing the rest of the panel, I'm going to pass you over to Alex Buckman, who's a practice manager for networks and energy storage at the Energy Systems Catapult, and get him to give us a little rundown of what you do over there. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, so as Paddy said, my name's Alex. I work for the Energy Systems Catapult, and we were set up to accelerate the transformation of the UK's energy system and ensure UK businesses and consumers capture the opportunities of clean growth. So we're one of 9 catapults established, overseen and part funded by Innovate UK, and crucially, we're independent from the government and not-for-profit. Some of the activities we do include innovator support, research, trials, modelling and simulation, and we take a whole systems view. So we join up the system from sources of energy to the consumer, breaking down silos between different parts of the energy system, such as electricity, heat and transport, and joining up physical requirements of the system with policy, market and digital arrangements. So I'm really excited about today's webinar. Our electricity grid brings together so many aspects of the energy system, reaching beyond electricity itself. And we have a fantastic panel who will bring different insight perspectives to the table.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's great. It's good to have you here. If I'll run through in no particular order. So we've got esteemed colleagues, and I don't think either of you have met one another before particularly, but we've got a selection of experts in their field. So we've got Mark Neller, who's a project management director, Arup. We've got Alexandra Golisano, who's a strategy and marketing director at Schneider Electric. We have Marzia Zafar, who's the head of customer strategy and policy at Caluz, which is part of the OVO group. And we've got Izzy Middleton, who's the program manager at the Northern Power Grid. So as I said, the topic for today's discussion is decarbonising the electricity grid. And if I'll start just pitch in whenever you want to say something, but we've got the first question is, what are the key technologies and innovation sectors that will support the decarbonisation of the electricity system? So anyone that wants to chip in with that one, absolutely far away.
I'm happy to kick off and provide some opening thoughts. So when thinking about this one, so the electricity system, from our point of view, pretty much needs to reach net zero. There are some parts of the system that can have a few emissions left and that we can then abate. But the electricity system needs to go right down to the net zero. So we can take big chunks of those emissions out through some of the kind of standard the obvious technologies like wind and also nuclear, we feel. But then for me, it's when you get down to the final 10 or 20% of those emissions that it starts getting quite difficult. So at the majority, a lot of our flexibility comes from fossil fuels. So over 99% of demand turn up on the balancing mechanism is fossil fuel based. And within a cold week, you could see about 80% of flexibility provided by fossil fuels. So when you look at nuclear and wind, they're fairly inflexible. So I think some crucial technologies to allow that final bit of decarbonisation is around storage and flexibility, whether that be behind the meter flexibility or whether it be kind of large scale storage on the network somewhere.
If I can add to what Alex is saying, so I think the key to decarbonization. I think we're all in agreement that by 2050, the law, at least in the UK, is to get to net zero by 2050. And how do you get there? Can you get there affordably, and you can get there by adding extra infrastructure? So it's dependent on the decisions that you want to make. I mean, energy is a basic necessity. We have to make sure that it is affordable for everybody. And that's where I think a company like Kaluza comes in. We are a technology company looking to find solutions that make it easier for the customers, especially residential customers, to engage in the system. So, for instance, our flexibility platform allows domestic flexibility to take off by enabling residential customers using smart devices like EVs, like heat pumps, to connect to the Kaluza platform, set their parameters, and then allow us to optimize for renewable generation, optimize for price, and still get them the charging that they're looking for. Another solution that we're also looking at is enabling retail energy retail providers to to have a better relationship with the customer. And ideally for us, for OVO and for Kaluza, we think that residential customers have to become active participants of the grid in order for us to have an affordable decarbonization by 2050. And so whether it's domestic flexibility through our Flex platform, or whether it's using the software platform that we're providing for retailers that will lower their cost to serve, but also will allow them to engage with their end use customers to get to that decarbonization goal.
Great.
Yeah, I could just chip in a little on this one as well. So I think I totally agree with the comments from Alex and Maria around the innovation required in technology and flexibility. I think in terms of sort of where's that replacement for fossil fuel flexibility generation coming from, I think we need to look more widely at the mix of generating capacity we have on the network. So I think we need to look at, are there roles for other technologies, tidal generation? Can we link that in with storage? And I also think that the sector coupling play with hydrogen is really interesting here. So if we're going to do carbon capture and storage, actually doing pre-combustion, converting fossil fuels into hydrogen, and then using that as our flexibility backup to wind, I think is a really interesting proposition. But actually none of that requires new technology per se. It's much more about new business models and innovation in the way in which we deploy rather than the technology itself.
And as Mark was saying, I think the technology exists now. It's clear. Now we know that we need to stop carbon generation. We need to add more wind. We need to add more tidal. All the technology exists, but we need to have maybe a push from the Ofgem, for example, and the policy just to force the system to change. And then in parallel, we will need much more efficiency in the way people use energy and all the system use energy. And there is great company providing technology to improve this efficiency. And ultimately, it's a completely change of mindset for the consumer, because we need to bring the consumer in the story and force them actually to change and limit the demand, because if we have a better management of the demand, it would be perfect for the supply as well.
Okay.
So I don't want to oversimplify this, but I think the key to the success will be managing the data and encouraging different human behaviours and encouraging the psychology of individuals to want to participate, giving them the tools and the apps that actually give them the dopamine hit of, yeah, I've done a good thing and this makes sense. So I think there's a psychology element to this as well, that customers want to encourage their suppliers, and they choose organisations that are seen to be doing the right things. But I think ultimately marshalling the data, I think, is going to be one of the hardest things.
Patty, if I could just say one more thing. I think, we have customers are becoming aware. I think it's about now figuring out how we're going to transition from awareness to action. How can we get these customers, make it easier for them, and then changing static demand into dynamic demand, because we will no longer have flexible supply. So supply is going to be all over the place. This is why we need to make demand more flexible.
Okay, and what do we think? So the changes in demand, how is this going to influence the challenges associated with the electricity network, with the decarbonisation of it? How do you think? What are the challenges that we're facing here?
Well, more. So, from my perspective, there's two ways to approach that question. There's one is around the kind of the demand on the networks and kind of where that demand's coming from. So I don't know, so it's like the higher uptake of electric vehicles or the higher uptake of heat pumps, and the changing demands that those different technologies place on the network. And so generally you think more electrification means more extreme peaks, and and therefore meeting those extreme peaks kind of relates to the previous question that we're discussing. But then the other side of it is the shape and the controllability of that demand. So if we can shape the demand to be less peaky and aligned with available resource, it will support network decarbonisation as a knock-on effect. And so we can do this through various means. And kind of some of the people on the call are involved in these kind of activities, but I know it could be preheating some homes or by charging vehicles overnight, or potentially dropping the set point of a home if you understand those consumers more. And that links to what Izzy was saying around having buy-in from consumers and kind of getting people's buy-in. So it's and from our perspective, and this links to something that Mark said around business models, this is likely to be most possible if consumers kind of relinquish some control to some other third party. And so we're doing a lot of work into heat or comfort or energy as a service and as a mechanism to try and allow that kind of shaping of demand.
Yeah.
And you have, I think the UK, according to National Grid, in 2020, peak demand or dispatchable generation was about 64 gigawatts. It's expected that by 2050, because of transport, because more EVs and more heat pumps and just general growth of demand, you're going to see, I believe, 104 gigawatts of peak demand. So how are you going to meet this and still have your decarbonization goals? It's a tall order. And I think, we have to go back to consumers. We have to go back to engaging these customers to want to participate in the grid. And how do we make it easier for them? And domestic flexibility is key to this.
And I think we have on one side the peak demand, but we have as well the full demand and the terawatt hour boom in the next 20 years. And in the report Marcia was mentioning of National Grid, there will be probably a peak of, let's say, an increase of 70% of the demand coming from EV uptake or electric heating, as Alex was saying. And actually, in this 70% peak, there is a completely new challenge. It's EV and it's a mobile demand. And this mobile demand, of course, will evolve in the network. And it will represent almost 20% of the demand in 2050. So I think this big challenge will come from the new type of demand and this mobile demand in the network. And of course, after to shape or to limit the peak when we charge our cars, we will need to implement smart system to help the consumer just to, without thinking, without asking, just using a system perfectly limiting the peak in the demand.
But in addition to being mobile, it could also be used for storage and then usage locally.
Yeah.
So not only is it moving around and taking a lot more electricity than it would typically be, a traditional appliance, but also the fact it's moving and it can be used to plug back into the grid in theory if you wanted it to. So the movements, the push and pull, and the visibility of what's happening on the network at any one point in time, the management of real-time and accurate forecasts is going to be a challenge.
You're on mute.
I think that's one of my biggest areas of concern is just how much uncertainty there is at the moment around how we are going to be able to shift and peak or otherwise. So, it seems pretty clear from all the analysis that absolute total amount of energy moving around the system as electrons is absolutely going to go up, and the peak could be really very big. And the really unknown question is how to what extent are we going to be able to influence consumer behaviour? Are we going to be able to use digital solutions in order to shift that peak around to minimise the need for upgrades? And I think that a really big problem is it's almost at the point where we need to invest now in order that we can actually bring on the additional renewable generation, the new demand, because it's kind of, we can't just wait until the demand comes along because you just can't scale it up fast enough. So I think a really important message is we need to get on investing now in upgrading the network and figure out just exactly how much of that peak we're going to be able to shift through changing behaviour and through incentivization mechanisms and through technology.
Patty, I'm not gonna do the last word other than this one, but I just got excited about V2G. I mean, imagine if we have 10 million cars on the road and they all have V2G at home, usually, and potentially at work, because V2G can not only import but export electricity. Can be your storage, but it can also be your generator. Right now it may not be cost effective, but if we invest in this technology, and by the time we get those vehicles on the road, V2G could be a huge boost in allowing the existing grid to operate without adding extra infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to let you get the last word, Marzi, on this one then. I think I just want to link back to Mark's point there as well, that we're talking about business models, we're talking about changing consumer behavior, and therefore we're talking about, can we do this? Can we can we make all the kind of demand shaping that we need to do in order to minimize the costs associated with electricity reinforcement? And I suppose the question is, what are the risks? Because if we are not able to do what we are hoping to do, then the cost implications for the electricity network in general and the electricity system and the energy system are large. And electricity networks, by their nature, are generally more expensive to reinforce than other networks. So I think we're not necessarily going down the route of saying everything needs to be electrified. It needs to be a balanced system that also minimizes the risk of what we might end up with in 2050 if we're not able to do all of this amazing innovation and implement all these business models that we say are needed.
Kind of leads in nicely actually to you've touched on the infrastructure there, but how will the energy network infrastructure have to change to keep up or to support the low carbon emissions targets and zero emission that we're hoping for? How do we think, what changes can support that?
I think we need to have much better data about what's actually going on at the network at a very granular level. To Izzy's point earlier on in the conversation, we absolutely need to be able to understand what's happening in order that we can work out how to move the peaks around, how to respond with flexibility. So having a much more intelligent network with data collection points right the way down to individual local transformer level and down into the consumer's home is absolutely imperative. And we need some significant investment now in putting that monitoring equipment in place so that we can start validating the models that we do have and start understanding how we can or we can't shift that flexibility around. So I think that's a really important early change that needs to be done.
I would say ditto to everything Mark just said, and we've said this in the Rio case with Ofgem, that distribution network companies need that monitoring infrastructure so that all the stakeholders can get visibility to where the local constraints are, so then we could focus the flexibility, domestic flexibility or C&I flexibility there. So you need data and you need transparency to make this happen. You need to make it an intelligent grid, and that requires investment, and it also requires DNOs to want to give that information to stakeholders.
And as we are more players in the grid today compared to the past days, I think we will need to have much more smart system, because today we need more data, of course, to feed all the players. So smart system is key. We will need as well to have more active network management, because the system will be more complex. So we need to have the technology to work on both ways and to limit the load on the network. And limit as well and play with voltage regulation on the system. And finally, as Marcia was saying, we will need more aggregators in the market, because you will have more flexibility, and we need to consolidate the view, because the point of generation are smaller. It's now multi-million points of generation, when in the past it was hundreds. So we need to aggregate them and to be able to play and have a weight in the decision of the network in future.
And if anything, 2020 has shown us that things change quickly. So having monitoring is great and access to historic trends and where we think the constraints are. But new connections, new flexibility services and agreements and different customer behaviour can change things very quickly. So having access to trustable data that can be used reliable for good decisions, it's going to be imperative.
And from my point of view, flexibility or not, there's likely to be a huge amount of reinforcement that's going to be needed on the networks by 2050. So, ideally, we'd want to be able to reinforce far ahead of time to make sure that we're not going over and reinforcing networks in another 10 years' time to account for the as we get towards 2050. But another point, in some recent work that we've done, we've been looking at kind of the spatial distribution of network reinforcement requirements. And so I think in general, we agree that by 2050, in a fairly kind of balanced scenario where you have a mixture of heat networks and maybe a bit of hydrogen in there, then the average kind of ratio of peak demand then to what we have now, which is kind of what drives network reinforcement, would be kind of some in the order of kind of between 1.5 and 3, that kind of thing. But if you then start breaking that down into smaller areas, we see that although the average is that you have a distribution, and in some of those areas you're looking at peaks that are maybe 4, 5, 6 times what they are now. And when you look at the types of network that we have and the cables that we have, it actually drives a lot more cost to reinforce those areas than it does to reinforce the ones that need kind of the 1.5, 2 times the peak reinforcement. And so I think the idea around understanding where all these demands are going to be, and therefore using data and having transparent data, is going to be really important to target where we have the reinforcement in the networks.
I think the other thing that's really important here is not just the model of what's going on, but also resilience. So as we start to stress the assets more and more, and the peak becomes bigger and bigger, we really need to understand what level of resilience we've got in our energy system today, and what level of resilience we want to have in our energy system of the future. It may well be that we want to trade resilience for cost at some points in the network, but we absolutely need to make sure we're making that from a position of being informed about the implications of that. It can't be something that we do by accident without considering those resilience implications and consistency of supply.
I think Alex touched on needing to find a balance between the different networks, and how does this decarbonised system, how does it need to interact with the other networks? Is there a way we can create a more integrated system between the different networks? What do we think of that?
I know I begin again, but securely and robustly taking on board the cyber risk, the necessity of the important utility of this in our lives means that it's vital to protect. And for those that are vulnerable, it's absolutely essential that we are thinking through ahead of time how any changes might have a wider implication on society. So surfacing this data in a way that is mindful of the criticality of what it means to people's lives.
And
I think the other thing I'd just add on sort of integration with other energy systems is the work that's been done looking at the potential role of hydrogen in the gas grid, the ability to convert excess renewables into hydrogen, either as a sort of interseasonal storage or as a direct means of putting hydrogen into the gas grid. I think we're going to see more and more just how important that is in getting to a lowest cost solution in the future. So there's been a lot of work done, looked at hybrid heat pumps in the home. I think the conversation we had earlier about hydrogen being used as flexibility for power generation. I think that sort of sector coupling between gas grid and the electricity grid, and really understanding how we optimize that is critical to making sure that what we end up with is the lowest cost solution, as well as obviously making the best possible use we can of our low grade heat, so that we don't waste any of the energy.
And to pursue on the point from Mark, it's definitely key to have hydrogen at home. So smart home, smart system could detect if a peak is coming and just say, let's stop using electricity for heating or cooking and let's use hydrogen. So hydrogen could be in the same network if we use hydrogen in the gas network, but then we could use hydrogen in carbon storage just to create a new methane, and maybe this methane could replace the natural gas. So actually both networks are becoming converging on the same way, and we could play with both of them just to make sure we can balance the peak with hydrogen.
And I assume when we talk about hydrogen, we mean green hydrogen or blue hydrogen with CCS.
Yeah, I take that as an absolute given. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I agree that the interaction between electricity and hydrogen is going to be key. I mean, I suppose from taking a step back to kind of the whole system, at the moment, our electricity and our gas networks are fairly independent of each other. You obviously have that interaction at thermal generation sites, but apart from that, there's not much interaction between those two vectors. But now what we're seeing in kind of models of the future is we have interaction across different energy vectors, whether that be hydrogen, whether that be gas with CCS or biomass, say. And then you go down to the distribution networks and you start having interaction between electricity and heat networks. And then you go down into people's homes and you have interaction between hydrogen and electricity or gas electricity with hybrid heating systems. And then you have potentially hybrid vehicles where you have those different kind of combinations of energy vectors. And so it starts getting really complex. How do you then operate and regulate a system and get your price signals right to make sure that you incentivize minimization of whole system costs rather than being independent systems from each other? It's a really hard thing to do. I'd love to hear anyone on this panel's views of how to do that.
I think we also have to be cognizant of not putting all our eggs in one basket, whether that's electrification, whether that's renewables or hydrogen. We have to have diversity of supply, not only for just resiliency of the system, but to deliver affordable energy to consumers.
I think it definitely sounds like a complex problem when Alex sort of details it like that. So obviously you've touched a lot on how you need the data and the analysis of the data to be able to provide, the energy and what, how can the advancements in digitalization, we've touched on it quite a bit really, but how can the advancements in digitalization support decarbonisation? I think we've just, you've mentioned a lot about the data, and I think that's probably one of the primary objectives is to get more data. And that, is there any other advancements in the digital sphere that would help, do you think?
I think data and digitalization just will bring consumers into the system, and we need consumers, especially residential consumers, to come in and no longer be bill payers and instead be active participants and allow us to engage in that demand response, allow us to engage in that domestic flexibility. And the way you do that is you utilize, as Izzy said, you utilize data, you bring in information and transparency into the system. And flexibility, domestic flexibility is key to decarbonization, no matter how you look at it. Until we have effective cost-effective green hydrogen that will give us long-term storage, you need domestic flexibility to be able to come in and allow for maximum renewable generation and to optimize costs. So the domestic flexibility cannot happen without digitalization.
In terms of supporting decarbonisation within the electricity system itself, obviously we're talking about physical constraints and cable life, technical and non-technical losses. So the more the peaks are flattened, the more efficiently the network can be managed and safely and smoothly and efficiently. and then obviously rewards the customer.
Yeah, I think that everything that you both just said fits into some of the work that we've done recently on the Energy Data Task Force, so for Government, Ofgem and Innovate UK, and it, I mean, without wanting to go into it too much, basically the 5 stages that came out of that were data visibility, being able to understand all the data that exists, then infrastructure and asset visibility, so just having data on where are all our assets and what are their kind of technical parameters, as you say, there are physical constraints that we need to understand. Then it's okay, so operational optimization, so enabling operational data to be layered on top of those assets, creating open markets, and then that would eventually allow for agile regulation, so enabling regulators to adopt a much more agile and risk reflective approach. And so we agree that data and digitalization is crucial, and without it you expose some of those risks that we talked about earlier on in the discussion. And
having the data, it will help startups or company to create new business model or new services for the market, and with more players, maybe less costly for the consumer at the end. So that's key. And 2, because we have more and more players, the rate of decentralization is high. It will help actually the grid to stay stable and resilient if we have a view of all the different players, because it's key to keep a certain high level view of all the network. So that's my view on the subject.
We're getting to the point where we're effectively what we're talking about here is the need to create effectively a digital twin of the energy system, both in terms of its assets and its capabilities, and then also the operations of what's going on at that network. And I think trying to do that as a demonstration of what you can achieve is something that we should be looking to do quickly. So taking a section of the network, both the gas network, the electricity network, heat networks, and actually modeling a city digitally, so that we can look at the energy that's coming in, where it's being used, how it's moving around, and figuring that out at a detailed level. I think something we should be looking to do really quickly.
It seems like, for me, I'm a bit of an outsider to the industry. It feels like there's almost, in terms of the data side, there needs to be some kind of encouragement for the consumer to be able to share their data and give them an impetus to help the whole system as a whole, as their section of it. But you touched on there about decentralized, the system's being decentralized, Alex. So if we compare centralized v decentralized, what are the key benefits and the drawbacks for both? What do we?
For me, this is quite a controversial subject, and I'm not sure if we're going to have different views across the panel. I think we've agreed quite a lot so far, but from our point of view, a fully centralized system, like the one that we've relied upon predominantly in the past, won't create a well-functioning low-carbon net zero energy system. But the questions are, what should be decentralized and how much? Because rightly or wrongly, we are having decentralization happen already. So things like feed-in tariffs encourage people to develop small-scale distributed renewable generation, for example. And some of that is great because you have low-carbon generation in the system, but then it also has a bit of a backlash effect on networks. And so decentralization in general could support community ownership and may go hand in hand with other behavior changes, and would lessen the technical challenge of net zero, such as getting engagement from people to lower set points or accept lower set points. It might even go hand in hand with things like diet changes and flying less, that whole scenario of behavior change and getting ownership of climate change. But decentralized flexibility for me is a crucial one. So our low carbon generation sources aren't as flexible as our existing ones. And so that flexibility needs to come from somewhere. And so that flexibility has to be pushed elsewhere in the system. So decentralized flexibility is the key, but centralization of some of the the bigger generation is also pretty crucial. I think you can't really have big offshore wind farms while also being centralized. Nuclear power plants are a low carbon form of energy, and they tend to be pretty big. And so that centralized approach is still needed in some aspects.
Yeah, I would say that, I don't think it's a either or. It's not a versus one or the other. There should be a combo. As we move forward, the system will be decentralized to the extent that it can, but it doesn't make sense to say, you know what, you need generation to be localized at every single level, because you still have the nuclear power plants, you still have those big wind farms, you still have the solar fields, and it doesn't make sense to say, do away with all of that, and each house has to produce its own generation. So you have to have a combo, and you have to. I think that's also will make it more cost effective for the customer. I do want to go back quickly. I think, Patty, you mentioned something about customers earlier, that customers will have to become engaged. I think the onus is on the energy retail providers. The onus is on the market players to give the right value propositions for these customers to want to engage. We can't just say, you know what, this is now, you have to do this. We've all been born into this system, this society, where we assume that we're going to turn on the light comes on, we'll pay our bill, and electricity energy is boring. We have to unboring the energy in order for consumers to want to engage in. Sorry, I just made up that word, unboring. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's key. I'm not sure there is a debate, and everybody had the same comment, but we need to have a grid fit for purpose and to become more cleaner, more cheaper for the consumers, to limit the fuel poverty, and finally more agile. So you will have a mix of decentralization and centralization, and actually all the small private network or microgrid needs to be connected somewhere to the grid for a base load generation. But ultimately they need to be not dependent. They need to be able to play alone, to be agile in case of if there is any issue on the network.
All righty. Well, I mean, that's the end of the set questions I had. Is there anything anybody wanted to add? We've covered it quite swiftly, but I feel like we've got through quite a lot there. Is there anything anybody else wants to add to?
We all agreed. We need to disagree on something.
So as network operators, we're all preparing our business plans for the next price control period, which will run from 2023. It's quite challenging getting out your crystal ball, but some of the questions that we've been asking our stakeholders are how local, how fast and how flexible we need to be on some of these, how ambitious do they want us to be in terms of the decarbonisation. And obviously we're looking to Ofgem, they're pushing us to be as cost effective as possible. So we need to hear from our customers and stakeholders to say what it is that they want us to do.
I think that's a really good point, Izzy. I think actually the next round of regulatory settlement is absolutely critical to get right, and I'm really worried by what I've seen from what the transmission settlement proposal is and the gas network settlement proposal is. At this vital stage, we have to be investing in these energy networks, and we have to make sure that the settlement balances correctly the interests of consumers and the interests of getting private sector investment in. That's absolutely essential if we're going to meet the net zero challenge. And whilst you might argue that the balance has not quite been right for the last regulatory settlement period, I don't think it actually helps to now swing the pendulum too far the other way, to the point where there is simply no incentive to invest the capital that's required in the massive infrastructure upgrades that are required across all of our energy networks. I would
challenge the massive infrastructure requirements, and I think there's certainly a need for investment in infrastructure, because we're not going to go from 64 gigawatts to 104 gigawatts just using flexibility. Nobody's saying that. But there has to be also from the distribution network companies. I think the market also needs to see a clear signal from them that they're looking beyond just infrastructure upgrade, that they're also going to be looking at flexibility, that they're going to be looking at all solutions, because infrastructure upgrade, if I was a distribution network company, would be my survival mode. And that's not good for end use customers. If we do that, it's going to make net zero cost prohibitive by 2050.
Yeah, but I think you know, if you look at what we've got to do to land 40 gigawatts of offshore wind down the east coast by 2030, that there's only one way to do that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I absolutely recognise, but that flexibility needs to play a part in mitigating some of those infrastructure costs. But I think, you know, the points Alex has already made is even if you take the most optimistic assumptions you can of energy efficiency, you know, very efficient uptake of electric vehicles, very efficient heat pumps, and the best assumptions you can on flexibility and moving the peak, I don't think you get away from the fact that there is a massive amount of investment required in electricity networks.
Yeah, so I can probably put some numbers onto that from some of the work that we've done recently. So if we look at just the electricity system, and in a fairly low, in an electricity system that is also supported by heat networks and hydrogen, some existing analysis is looking at kind of 150 billion pounds investment. Our recent analysis is looking more towards a 250 billion pounds. If you then go, and that's it within an optimistic scenario around flexibility as well. If you then went down in a fully electrified scenario, or a scenario where you don't have that flexibility, then that starts to increase really quickly. And so, and then the other thing to kind of put into that equation is the cost of all the other infrastructure. I know this is about decarbonising the electricity system, but if you were to then add on the 150 billion or so requirement into kind of hydrogen networks or carbon dioxide networks or heat networks, then it becomes a really huge investment into a decarbonised system. And when you look at the scale of private investment that goes into our current infrastructure year on year, it's dwarfed by what we need.
I mean, I do not disagree at all. I'm not saying that we don't need investment in infrastructure. What I'm saying is that domestic flexibility specifically is at a very, very early stage. It needs help from all the market players. It needs help from the policymakers. It needs help from DNOs. It needs help from the national grid, and it needs help from the customer itself. If we don't focus on it now, we're going to lose that market. And then, in addition to the hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to get the infrastructure going, we have to do an additional, and that's what's going to make it cost prohibitive, I think. So what I think what we're suggesting is, let's not completely ignore flexibility. Let's not just say flexibility is great, but let's not do anything about it and not act on it. We need to act on creating the market for flexibility, in addition to making the right investments on it for infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think in flexibility, for me, it does two things. And flexibility, not just behind the meter flexibility, but also things like advanced network management and all other flexibility throughout the system. It minimizes the amount of investment that you will have to make, and it also creates a more resilient system. And so electricity networks are kind of they're operated in real time pretty much. And so if we're unable to manage fairly kind of unexpected peaks and troughs through flexibility of some sort, then we end up with quite kind of big consequences.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Alex, Mark, Marzia, and Izzy. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and discuss this with us today. As I said, hopefully we'll see some of you at the Excel Centre next September for the Expo, the Elemental Expo at the Excel Arena in London. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for joining us, and take care and look after yourselves. All right.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Patty.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.